Good evening. I'm your host, Karen Hudis, in this series on the network of global corporate control. Today's segment is called The Moors and is pre-recorded. Thanks to DCTV and Maurice Jackson, studio producer and director, and we've got Cruchet Starnes, who's on audio and prompter. We have to watch out that efforts to divide the United States along racial lines by that agent of the banking cartel, Donald Trump, fail. That is why this segment is devoted to learning about the Moors. And I have been tweeting about this. I called one of the tweets, How the Banking Cartel Started the Civil War in the United States. And you can see from the teleprompter how that happened. And the Moors are also sometimes referred to as the Berbers and also the Tuareg. And all of these terms are actually foreign names, and they're offensive to these people. I also want to acknowledge a website which I have largely drawn from in preparing the teleprompter this evening. And you need to take the dates in the teleprompter with a grain of salt, because we have already learned from the Chronologia website from Moscow State University that the Jesuits have actually lied to us about what the actual dates are. And in Iberia, Spain and Portugal, and the Iberian Peninsula is very close to Africa, and it has been inhabited for at least 1 million years. And about 45,000 BC, the African Grimaldi became the first modern man to enter Europe as he crossed the Gibraltar Straits and started his journey across Europe. Europe and Africa are now separated by 7.7 nautical miles. During glacial periods, it was much less distance. And in a previous episode, we've shown how Atlantis was located at precisely that spot. During the Neolithic expansion, various megalithic cultures developed in Iberia. An open seas navigation culture from the East Mediterranean, probably from Crete, was called the Cardium culture, and it extended its influence to the eastern coast of Iberia, possibly as early as the 5th millennium BC. And in the Copper Age, which was around 3000 BC in Iberia, there was a series of complex cultures that developed, and this gave rise to the first civilizations in Iberia and to extensive exchange networks, that's trading networks, which reached to the Baltic, the Middle East, and North Africa. At about 2150 BC, the Beaker culture intruded into Chalcolithic Iberia, being of Celtic origin, and around 1100 BC, the Phoenician merchants founded the trading colony of Gadir or Gades, which is modern-day Cadiz. And as we've seen, the Phoenicians were a branch of Atlantis. It was near a city called Tartessos, and the Phoenician merchants were a fragment left over from Atlantis. In the 8th century BC, the first whites arrived. The Greeks established colonies such as Emporion, which was modern Emporides, and these were founded along the Mediterranean coast on the east, leaving the south coast to the Phoenicians. The Greeks are responsible for the name Iberia, named after the river Iber, or Ebro. In the 6th century BC, the Phoenician Carthaginians arrived in Iberia while struggling with the Greeks for control of the western Mediterranean. Their most important colony was Carthago Nova, and the Latin name is for the modern-day Cartagena. In 219 BC, the first Roman troops invaded the Iberian Peninsula, and this was during the Second Punic War against the Carthaginians. After 2 centuries of war with the Celtic and Iberian tribes, and also the Phoenician, Greek, and Carthaginian colonies, Rome annexed it under Augustus, resulting in the creation of the province of Hispania. It was divided into Hispania Ulterior and Hispania Citerior during the late Roman Republic, and during the Roman Empire it was divided into Hispania Tarraconensis in the northeast and Hispania Baetica in the south and Lusitania in the southwest. In the early 5th century AD, new whites invaded. These were Germanic tribes from Eastern Europe, namely the Suevi, the Vandals, Silingi, and Hastingi, and their allies, the Sarmatian Alans. Only the kingdom of the Suevi, Cadi, and Marcomanni would endure after the arrival of another wave of Germanic invaders, the Visigoths, who had earlier established their own kingdom with its capital at Toulouse, France. They slowly extended their authority into Hispania, displacing the Vandals and Alans. The Visigoths subsequently conquered all of the Iberian Peninsula and expelled or partially integrated the Vandals and the Alans. The Visigoths eventually conquered the Suevi kingdom and its capital city, Bracara, which is the modern-day Braga, in 584 to 585 AD. They would also conquer the province of the Byzantine Empire, Spania, in the south of the peninsula and the Balearic Islands. Let's talk about the Moors. White historians, in their bid to make ancient Europeans seem white, have chosen to ignore the obvious relationships that must have existed between the Berbers and the people of Iberia. When Grimaldi crossed the Gibraltar Straits to enter Europe, all of his kind didn't follow. When humans moved to new territories, most stay behind in the old territory, and they maintain their relationships. There's always back and forth travel for trade and communication. It's against this backdrop that the Berber invasion of Iberia must be viewed. The Berbers did not enter Iberia as destroyers. They entered as builders. Thus, after Muhammad's Islamic army took Egypt in 640 AD and then went on to conquer all of North Africa, the Berbers no doubt saw this new black army as an opportunity. So rather than fight, the Berbers joined forces with the Islamic army. In 711 AD, a Berber army led by General Tariq ibn Ziyad invaded Iberia, that's Spain, and overthrew the white Visigoths, which were also called the Western Goths, who were also one of the 2 main branches of the Goths, an East Germanic tribe who over the period of only 100 years had migrated from Eastern Europe through Greece, through Italy, and finally down into the Iberian Peninsula. In Iberia, Spain and Portugal, the Berbers, now known as Moors, created a highly advanced civilization and culture, famous for its art, architecture, and centers of learning. While having rule over Spain, the Berbers, who themselves 50 years earlier had been forced to accept Islam, now sometimes force the inhabitants of Iberia to do the same. Though the number of original Moors remained small, many native Iberian inhabitants converted to Islam. According to Ronald Siegel, some 5.6 million of Iberia's 7 million inhabitants were Muslim by the 1200 AD, and virtually all of them were native inhabitants. According to historian Richard A. Fletcher, the number of Arabs who settled in Iberia was very small. There were about 900,000 Berbers and about 90,000 Arabs in Iberia. And I'll give you a little more history a little bit later in this segment. And let's talk about Muslim Spain and European culture. When you think of European culture, one of the first things that may come to your mind is the Renaissance. Many of the roots of European culture can be traced back to that glorious time of art, science, and commerce and architecture. But did you know that long before the Renaissance, there was a place of humanistic beauty in Muslim Spain? Not only was it artistic, scientific, and commercial, but it also exhibited incredible tolerance, imagination, and poetry. Moors, as the Spaniards called the Muslims, populated Spain for nearly 700 years. As you'll see, it was their civilization that enlightened Europe and brought it out of the Dark Ages to usher in the Renaissance. Many of their cultural and intellectual influences still live with us today. Way back during the 8th century, Europe was still knee-deep in the medieval period. That's not the only thing they were knee-deep in. In his book, The Day the Universe Changed, the historian James Burke describes how the typical European townspeople lived. Quote, "The inhabitants threw all their refuse into the drains in the center of the narrow streets. The stench must have been overwhelming, though it appears to have gone virtually unnoticed. Mixed with excrement and urine would be the soiled reeds and straw used to cover the dirt floors. This squalid society was organized under a feudal system and had little that would resemble a commercial economy. Along with other restrictions, the Catholic Church forbade the lending of money, which didn't help get things booming much. Anti-Semitism, previously rare, began to increase. Money lending, which was forbidden by the church, was permitted under Jewish law, and this is according to Burke. And Jews worked to develop a currency, although they were heavily persecuted for it. Medieval Europe was a miserable lot which ran high in illiteracy, superstition, barbarism, and filth. Excuse me. During this same time, Arabs entered Europe from the south, and Abd al-Rahman, who was a survivor of a family of caliphs of the Arab Empire, reached Spain in the mid-700s. He became the first caliph of Al-Andalus, which is the Moorish part of Spain, and this occupied most of the Iberian Peninsula. He also set up the Umayyad dynasty that ruled Al-Andalus for over 300 years. Al-Andalus means the land of the Vandals, from which comes the modern-day Andalusia. At first, the land resembled the rest of Europe in all its squalor, but within 200 years, the Moors had turned Al-Andalus into a bastion of culture, commerce, and beauty. Irrigation systems imported from Syria and Arabia turned the dry plains into an agricultural cornucopia. Olives and wheat had always grown there. The Arabs added pomegranates, oranges, lemons, aubergines, artichokes, cumin, coriander, bananas, almonds, palms, henna, wood, madder, saffron, sugar cane, cotton, rice, figs, grapes, peaches, apricots, and rice. By the beginning of the 9th century, Moorish Spain was the gem of Europe, with its capital city, Cordova. With the establishment of Abdurrahman III, the Great Caliphate of Cordova, came the golden age of Al-Andalus. Cordova in southern Spain was the intellectual center of Europe. At a time when London was a tiny mud-hut village that could not boast of a single street lamp, in Cordova there were 500,000 inhabitants living in 113,000 houses. There were 700 mosques and 300 public baths spread throughout the city and its 21 suburbs. The streets were paved and lit. The houses had marble balconies for summer and hot air ducts under the mosaic floors for the winter. They were adorned with gardens, with artificial fountains and orchards. Paper, a material that was still unknown to the West, was everywhere. There were bookshops and more than 70 libraries. This rich and sophisticated society took a tolerant view towards other faiths. Tolerance was unheard of in the rest of Europe, but in Moorish Spain, thousands of Jews and Christians lived in peace and harmony with their Muslim overlords. The society had a literary rather than religious base. Economically, their prosperity was unparalleled for centuries. The aristocracy promoted private land ownership and encouraged Jews in banking. There was little or no Muslim proselytizing. Instead, non-believers simply paid an extra tax. In another of James Burke's works, titled Connections, he describes how the Moors thought out Europe from the Dark Ages. Quote, "But the event that must have done more for the intellectual and scientific revival of Europe was the fall of Toledo in Spain to the Christians in 1105. Close quote. In Toledo, the Arabs had huge libraries containing the lost, that is, lost to Christian Europe, works of the Greeks and Romans, along with Arab philosophy and mathematics. The Spanish libraries were opened, revealing a store of classics and Arab works that staggered Christian Europeans. The intellectual plunder of Toledo brought the scholars of Northern Europe like moths to a candle. The Christians set up a giant translating program in Toledo. Using the Jews as interpreters, they translated the Arabic books into Latin. These books included most of the major works of Greek science and philosophy, along with many original Arab works of scholarship. The intellectual community which the northern scholars found in Spain was so far superior to what they had at home that it left a lasting jealousy of Arab culture, which was to color Western opinions for centuries. The subjects covered by the texts included medicine, astrology, astronomy, pharmacology, psychology, physiology, zoology, biology, botany, mineralogy, optics, chemistry, physics, mathematics, algebra, geometry, trigonometry, music, meteorology, geography, mechanics, hydrostatics, navigation, and history. These works alone, however, didn't kindle the fire that would lead to the Renaissance. They added to Europe's knowledge, but much of it was unappreciated without a change in the way Europeans viewed the world. And this is the beginning of the end. In Iberia, many of the ousted white nobles took refuge in the unconquered North Asturian highlands. From there, they aimed to reconquer their lands from the Moors. This war of reconquest is known as the Reconquista. It began in about 900 AD, when a small Christian enclave of Visigoths in northwestern Spain, named Asturias, initiated conflicts between Christians and Muslims. soon after, Christian states based in the north and west, slowly in fits and starts, began a process of expansion and reconquest of Iberia over the next several hundred years. The end for the Moors came on January 2, 1492. The leader of the last Moorish city, Granada, located in southern Spain, surrendered to armies of a recently united Christian Spain after the marriage of Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile. This ended the 800-year reign of the Moors in Iberia. And the surrender of Granada. By some historical accounts, in 1491, Mohammed XII was summoned by Ferdinand and Isabella to surrender the city of Granada, and on his refusal, it was besieged by the Castilians. Eventually, on the 2nd of January, 1492, Granada was surrendered. In most sumptuous attire, the royal procession moved from Santa Fe to a place a little more than a mile from Granada, where Ferdinand took up his position by the banks of the Genil. A private letter written by an eyewitness to the Bishop of Leon only 6 days after the event recorded the scene. With the royal banners and the cross of Christ plainly visible on the red walls of the Alhambra, the Moorish Sultan, with about 80 or 100 on horseback, very well dressed, went forth to kiss the hand of their highnesses. According to the final capitulation agreement, both Isabel and Ferdinand will decline the offer, and the key to Granada will pass into Spanish hands without Mohammed XII having to kiss the hands of Los Reyes, as the Spanish royal couple became known. Mohammed XII, his indomitable mother, insisted on sparing the son this final humiliation, and the Moorish Sultan was received with much love and courtesy, and there they handed over to him his son, who had been a hostage from the time of his capture, and as they stood there, there came about 400 captives of this who were in the enclosure with the cross and a solemn procession singing the Te Deum Laudamus, and their highnesses dismounted to adore the cross to the accompaniment of the tears and reverential devotion of the crowd, not least of the Cardinal and Master of Santiago and the Duke of Cadiz and all the other grandees and gentlemen and people who stood there, and there was no one who didn't weep abundantly with pleasure, giving thanks to our Lord for what they saw, for they couldn't keep back the tears, and the Moorish Sultan and the Moors who were with him, for their part, couldn't disguise the sadness and pain they felt for the joy of the Christians, and certainly with much reason on account of their loss, for Granada is the most distinguished and chief thing in the world. Christopher Columbus seems to have been present. He refers to the surrender on the first page of his Diario de las Derrotas y Caminos. After your highnesses ended the war of the Moors who reigned in Europe and finished the war of the great city of Granada, where this present year, 1492, on the 2nd January, I saw the royal banners of your highnesses planted by force of arms on the towers of the Alhambra, which is the fortress of the city. I saw the Moorish Sultan issue from the gates of the said city and kiss the royal hands of your highnesses. And legend has it that as the royal party moved south towards exile, they reached a rocky prominence which gave a last view of the city. Mohammed XII reined in his horse, and surveying for the last time the Alhambra and the green valley that spread below, burst into tears. When his mother approached him, she said, "Weep like a woman for what you couldn't defend as a man." She doesn't sound very sympathetic, does she? The spot from which Mohammed XII looked for the last time on Granada is known as the Moor's last sigh, el último suspiro del Moro. It's probably not true. As we know, white people do tend to lie. I don't know who wrote that. Anyway, the Moor's last sigh, there's a picture of that, which I put in the teleprompter. And you should look at the faces. Already, it's a move to show that the Moors were white, when actually they were not. They were African. Mohammed XII was given an estate in Loja de Andarax, Las Alpujarras. That's a mountainous area between the Sierra Nevada and the Mediterranean Sea. But he soon crossed the Strait of Gibraltar to Fez, Morocco. The Spanish royal secretary, Fernando de Zafra, mentions in his letter of the 9th of December in 1492 that Muhammad XII and his followers leave Andarax, which left 1 month to go to Tlemcen, where he stayed a little longer. He left in September or October 1492. He explained that his wife died in Andarax, and she was buried in Mondujar. The remaining Muslims and Jews of Iberia were forced to leave Iberia or die, or convert to Roman Catholic Christianity. Many of the Jews who were expelled from Spain and Portugal immigrated to Holland, where they set up the Dutch West Indies Company, which was a prime mover in the Atlantic slave trade. That was also the precursor to the network of global corporate control. We have seen that the Dutch West Indies Company was a precursor to the network of global corporate control. Ironically, 8 months after the last Moorish city fell, it was in the nearby town of Palos on the evening of the 3rd of August, 1492, that Christopher Columbus would depart from Palos on his journey to the Americas, one result of which would be the Spanish and Portuguese Atlantic slave trade. The story of black slavery in the Americas, of course, begins with Christopher Columbus. It's alleged that his voyage to the Americas was not financed by Queen Isabella, but rather by the Jew Luis de Sant'Angelo, who supposedly advanced the sum of 17,000 ducats to finance the voyage. Columbus was accompanied by 5 Jews who had forsworn their religion and supposedly became Catholics: Luis de Torres, the interpreter; Marco the surgeon; Bemal the physician; Alonso de la Calle; and Gabriel Sanchez, and a black navigator, Pedro Alonso Nino, in 1468 to 1505. And I'm being told that we're just about running out of time, so if you read more of the teleprompter, you can see the history of the KKK, and you can see how the slave trade was actually profiting from the Moors, who had lost their kingdom. And it was the Moors, again, who preserved the knowledge from the Dark Ages, and they were the ones responsible for the Renaissance. I want to thank you for listening to another segment of the Network of Global Corporate Control. Reality means an end to the banking cartel and an exchange of paper currencies for gold in the global currency reset. Please stay tuned as we learn how to transition peacefully and end the corruption in the international financial system. Until next week, I'm your host, Karen Hudis.